Growing up in complicated family, to say the least. My mom passed away when I was 14, and her absence left a hole in our lives that we struggled to fill. My dad, always one to avoid sitting with grief, remarried within a year. Jenny, my stepmother, was everything my mom wasn't: loud, opinionated, and controlling. From the moment she moved into our home, Jenny made it clear she didn't want to compete with my mother's memory. Photos of my mom disappeared from the walls, her favorite chair was replaced, and any mention of her name was met with a pointed change of subject. My dad, eager to move on, let it all happen. My younger brother, Mark, only 10 at the time, adapted quickly. He bonded with Jenny, and she doted on him like he was her own son. I, however, couldn't accept her sudden presence in our lives. Her efforts to erase my mom felt like a betrayal, and my relationship with my dad became strained as a result. The rift between my father and me widened during my college years. While I worked multiple part-time jobs to pay for tuition, my dad refused to offer me any financial help, claiming it was a lesson in responsibility. Meanwhile, he fully funded Mark's education at an expensive private university, showering him with support and praise. Jenny, always quick to belittle me, often referred to my efforts to build my catering business as playing with a food truck. She would compare it to Mark's real career in finance, making it clear which of us she believed was more successful. The final blow came 6 years ago when my dad and Jenny sold our childhood home without informing me. By the time I found out, they had already moved into a new house, and all of my mom's remaining belongings, things I had hoped to keep, were gone. When I confronted my dad, he dismissed my anger as overly emotional and told me to move on. That was the moment I decided to go no contact with them. While my relationship with my family crumbled, I poured everything I had into my catering business. What began as a modest food truck during college eventually grew into a full-service catering company employing over 50 people and serving high-end events across Chicago. Sleepless nights, sacrifices, and relentless determination had paid off. I had built something I was proud of, something no one could take away from me. But even as my professional life flourished, the sting of being treated as an outsider in my own family never fully faded. It had been 6 years since I last spoke to my dad or Jenny, and nearly as long since I'd seen Mark. The distance between us wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a gap filled with unresolved anger and years of being overlooked. That's why I was so surprised when, one crisp afternoon, I found a wedding invitation in my mailbox. The invitation was simple but elegant, engraved with Mark and his fiancée Emma's names in gold lettering. Beneath the formal script was the date and venue, a high-end country club nestled in the suburbs. I stared at the card for a long time, unsure how to feel. On one hand, it was an olive branch, a rare acknowledgement from my family that I still existed. But on the other hand, it felt performative, as if inviting me was more about appearances than genuine reconciliation. For days, the invitation sat on my kitchen counter, a reminder of the emotional weight tied to that decision. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash and continue living my life without them. After all, they hadn't reached out to me in years. Why should I show up now? But another part of me couldn't shake the idea that this might be a chance to reconnect with Mark. Despite everything, I didn't harbor the same resentment toward him that I did toward our dad and Jenny. He had been swept up in their favoritism, sure, but he hadn't actively tried to push me away. In the end, I decided to attend. Not for my dad, not for Jenny, but for Mark. When the wedding day arrived, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and resolve. I dressed in a tailored suit, my appearance sharp but understated. This wasn't about making a statement. It was about showing up as the person I had worked so hard to become. Driving to the venue, my mind raced with thoughts of what might unfold. Would they welcome me? Ignore me? Would this be a step toward reconciliation or just another chapter in our strained relationship? As I pulled into the parking lot of the country club, the grandeur of the venue hit me. This was no small affair. Mark and Emma had clearly spared no expense. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, ready to face whatever awaited me inside. The country club was even more opulent inside than I'd imagined. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the room, and the tables were adorned with immaculate floral arrangements. It was the kind of setting that screamed, perfect wedding. But as I stepped inside, my stomach tightened. I scanned the crowd, taking in the faces of distant relatives and old family friends. A few offered polite nods, their expressions laced with curiosity. I could almost hear their thoughts. What's he doing here? Mark spotted me first. Dressed in a sharp tuxedo, he made his way through the crowd, a broad smile on his face. Hey, he said, pulling me into a firm hug. I didn't think you'd come. Neither did I admitted with a faint smile. But here I am. I'm glad, he said sincerely. It means a lot to me. For a moment, I felt a flicker of warmth. Maybe this day wouldn't be so bad after all. That hope was short-lived. As I made my way to my assigned table, I overheard Jenny's unmistakable voice behind me. Well, look who decided to show up, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. I guess even a food truck can afford a suit these days. I stopped in my tracks, the familiar sting of her words washing over me. Turning to face her, I saw the same smug expression I had come to associate with her. Jenny, I said evenly, always a pleasure. She smiled, a saccharine sweetness masking her condescension. We were just talking about how surprised we were to see you here. It's been so long, after all. I bit back a retort, reminding myself that I hadn't come here to engage with her. I'm here for Mark, I said simply, turning away before she could say anything else. Dinner was served shortly after, and the tension at my table was palpable. I was seated with a few relatives I hadn't seen in years, all of whom seemed unsure whether to make small talk or avoid me entirely. As the night went on, the speeches began. Mark's best man delivered a heartfelt toast, followed by Emma's maid of honor. When it was my dad's turn to speak, I felt my chest tighten. He stood at the head table, a glass of champagne in hand, and began recounting stories about Mark's childhood. His tone was jovial at first, but as the alcohol in his system took hold, his words grew more pointed. And of course, he said, glancing in my direction, we couldn't be prouder of Mark. He's everything a son should be, responsible, successful, loyal. The kind of man you can count on. The subtext was clear, and I could feel the eyes of the table shifting toward me. I clenched my jaw, refusing to let him see how much his words stung. By the time the dinner plates were cleared, I had reached my limit. Jenny's passive-aggressive comments, my dad's thinly veiled jabs. It was all too much. I excused myself and stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. As I stood on the patio, gazing out at the manicured golf course, I couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. This wasn't my family, not anymore. That's when a thought struck me. I wasn't just a guest here. I was more connected to this event than anyone realized. As I stood on the patio, the cool evening air offering a small reprieve from the tension inside, my mind wandered to the details of the wedding. The grandeur, the meticulous planning. It all felt over the top, even for Mark. Then it hit me. The catering. I had been so preoccupied with the family drama that I hadn't stopped to consider the connection. My company catered high-end events like this all the time. Curious, I walked back inside and made my way to the kitchen, slipping past guests unnoticed. When I stepped into the bustling prep area, the logo on the uniforms confirmed my suspicions. The catering team was from my company. One of the chefs noticed me and waved. Hey boss, didn't know you were here tonight. Yeah, I didn't either, I said, trying to mask the mix of emotions swirling inside me. I quickly found the event coordinator, a young woman named Rachel who had been with my company for a few years. She looked surprised to see me. Michael, what a surprise, she said. Are you here to check on the event? Something like that, I replied. When was this booked? Rachel pulled up the details on her tablet. It was finalized a few months ago. The bride and groom didn't book directly. Someone named Jenny handled most of the arrangements. Of course it was Jenny. I stared at the screen, a bitter realization sinking in. Jenny and my father had booked my company for the wedding without even knowing I owned it. The irony was almost laughable. As I left the kitchen, my emotions swung between anger and vindication. They had mocked me for years, belittled my career, and treated me like an afterthought. And now, here they were, unknowingly relying on the business they had dismissed as a food truck. I considered my options. Part of me wanted to confront them right then and there, to expose the truth in front of everyone. But as I replayed the evening in my head, the snide comments, the condescending tone, I realized something. I didn't owe them an explanation. Instead, I made a call. "Rachel," I said when she picked up, "I need you to pack everything up. We're pulling out of this event." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Positive," I said. "I'll cover any costs, but we're done here." When the staff began packing up, the chaos was immediate. Guests looked around in confusion as plates were cleared and buffet tables were dismantled. Jenny was the first to notice, rushing into the kitchen with a look of panic. "What's going on?" she demanded. Rachel, ever professional, calmly replied, "We've been instructed to leave. The owner made the call." Jenny's face twisted in confusion. "The owner? Who even is?" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as the realization hit her. I stepped into the room, meeting her stunned gaze. "Me," I said simply. For a moment, the kitchen fell silent. Then Jenny's expression shifted from shock to anger. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You're ruining everything." "No," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "You and Dad ruined everything a long time ago. I'm just reclaiming what's mine." The aftermath of my decision unfolded like a scene from a drama I hadn't meant to star in. As the catering team packed their equipment and left, the tension inside the venue reached a fever pitch. Guests whispered among themselves, some clearly confused, others looking on with growing curiosity. Jenny stormed back into the main hall, her face red with fury, and made a beeline for my father. I followed at a measured pace, keeping enough distance to watch the scene unfold without immediately stepping in. "What the hell is going on, Michael?" my father demanded when I finally approached. His face was flushed, the effects of alcohol amplifying his already fiery temper. "I think it's pretty clear," I said, meeting his glare without flinching. "The catering you booked? That's my company. And I decided I'm done being part of something where I'm treated like an outsider." He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "This isn't about you. This is Mark's wedding. You're just being petty." "Petty?" I said, my voice rising. "You spent the entire night making it clear that I don't belong here. Jenny's comments, your speech, you didn't even bother to hide it. So no, this isn't about Mark. This is about respect. And I'm done letting you use me while pretending I don't matter." The room fell silent as guests turned to watch the confrontation. Even Mark and Emma, who had been mingling with their friends, now stood frozen, their eyes darting between us. "Wait," Mark said, stepping forward. "What's going on?" Jenny, always quick to deflect, spun toward him. "Your brother just decided to ruin your wedding. That's what's going on." "Is that true?" Mark asked, looking at me. "I didn't ruin anything," I said, meeting his gaze. "But they booked my company to cater this wedding without even knowing I owned it. And after everything that's happened tonight, the way I've been treated, I decided I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore." Mark's face shifted, confusion giving way to understanding. "Your company? You own the catering business?" "Yes," I said. "The same business Jenny's mocked for years, calling it a food truck. The same business Dad couldn't bother to acknowledge while praising you for everything under the sun." Mark looked between me, Jenny, and our father, his expression darkening. "Mom, Dad, is that true?" Neither of them answered. The murmurs among the guests grew louder as they pieced together what was happening. Some looked at me with newfound respect, while others whispered behind their hands, casting side glances at Jenny and my father. "I didn't know," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know they booked your company or any of this." "I know you didn't," I said, softening slightly. "This isn't about you, Mark. It's about them." Jenny, clearly feeling the pressure of the growing audience, snapped, "You're acting like a child, Michael. You couldn't just let this one night be about someone else for a change?" Her words ignited the last of my patience. "This wasn't about someone else, Jenny," I said, my voice steady but firm. "This was about me being treated with respect, something you and Dad have never been willing to give. I've built a life I'm proud of, and I'm done letting you diminish it." With that, I turned to Mark and Emma. I'm sorry this happened on your wedding day, I said sincerely. You didn't deserve this, and I hope you can still enjoy the rest of your night. Mark nodded, his expression a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Thanks, Mike. And I'm sorry for everything. I nodded back before walking out of the venue, leaving the chaos behind me. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound accompanying my thoughts. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, vindication, sadness. The confrontation had been necessary, but it wasn't easy. For the first time in years, I had stood up for myself against the people who had belittled and dismissed me. It wasn't the way I had imagined things playing out, but it was a moment of clarity that had been long overdue. The days following the wedding were quiet but heavy. I didn't hear from my father or Jenny, and the silence felt louder than any words they could have said. For years, I had been the one to reach out, to bridge the gap, but this time I didn't. I was done chasing their approval. Mark was the first to contact me. He called a week after the wedding, his voice hesitant but sincere. "Mike," he began, "I wanted to thank you for coming to the wedding. I know things didn't go as planned, but I'm glad you were there." "Thanks, Mark," I said. "I meant what I said. I didn't do any of this to ruin your day." "I know," he replied. "I talked to Emma about everything, and we both feel awful about how you were treated. I didn't realize how bad things were between you and Mom and Dad. It's been like this for years," I admitted. "But it's not your fault." We spoke for over an hour, the conversation shifting from the wedding to our childhood and everything in between. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly connecting, free from the shadow of our parents' favoritism. The same couldn't be said for Jenny and my father. Word of the catering incident spread quickly among family and friends, and while some sided with them, many reached out to express their support. "You did the right thing," one relative said during a phone call. "They've been dismissive of you for too long." Even some of the wedding guests who had been there that night reached out, offering words of encouragement. "Seeing you stand up for yourself was inspiring," one friend of Mark's told me. It was about time someone called them out. Jenny, predictably, tried to twist the narrative. According to her, I had sabotaged the wedding out of spite, a claim that gained little traction once people learned the truth. 2 months after the wedding, I received an unexpected letter from my father. His handwriting was neat, almost too careful, as though he had rewritten the words multiple times before settling on what to say. "Michael," it began, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened at the wedding. I won't pretend to agree with how you handled it, but I realize now that I haven't been the father you needed. I'm sorry for the ways I've dismissed your accomplishments. I see now how much you've achieved, and I regret not telling you how proud I am. I let Jenny's opinions influence me more than they should have, and for that, I apologize. I don't expect things to be fixed overnight, but I'd like to talk if you're open to it." The letter was unexpected, and for days, I debated how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep the distance that had allowed me to heal. But another part of me, the one that still held onto a sliver of hope, felt compelled to give him a chance. When I finally called him, our conversation was awkward at first. He stumbled over his words, struggling to convey what he meant, but there was sincerity in his voice that I hadn't heard in years. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. Looking back on everything, I realized that standing up for myself at the wedding wasn't just about calling out their behavior. It was about reclaiming my narrative. For too long, I had let their opinions define my worth, but that day, I chose to value myself instead. My business continued to thrive, and I found joy in the life I had built on my own terms. I stayed in touch with Mark, and our relationship grew stronger as we left the baggage of our childhood behind. As for my father and Jenny, things remained complicated. While my father and I worked toward a fragile truce, Jenny remained distant, her pride too big to allow for meaningful conversation. And that was okay. To anyone who has felt dismissed or undervalued by their family, I want to say this. Your worth isn't defined by their approval. It's okay to walk away from relationships that hurt you, even if they're with the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means creating distance, and sometimes it opens the door to something new. Here's to finding strength, setting boundaries, and building a life that feels authentically your own.